Last lecture, we looked at the theories of Frederick Taylor, who formalized the principles of scientific management. Scientific management was an early attempt to systematically treat management and process improvement as a scientific problem. In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to the human relations school. Many of the practical problems we discussed in Taylorism led to its partial replacement, and perhaps more appropriately in a complementary fashion, by the human relations school. One of the major strands in the development of modern management was the increase in attention to human factors. This became known as the human relations school. Essentially, the approach declared that it was good business to look after the worker. It was born out of empirical studies of organizational fatigue and employee problems in particular. In the United States, Elton Mayo's detailed and continuing work in the Hawthorne experiments, widely publicized as it was, seemed to suggest that a new approach to motivation and employee care was both possible and sensible. Although aspects of this work were later to be questioned, they remained the largest and probably most influential work in this field into the 1960s. By the Second World War, a level of good management practice was established, principally in professional bodies, a limited educational establishment, and a body of thoughtful managers. In general, managers remained pragmatic in outlook, suspicious of new ideas, and they were wedded to the oversimplified sort of notions of the past. However, notions of leadership became of great interest, and efforts were made to develop the personal skills that it was sort of thought might best contribute to the more effective operation of the system. Adopting strategies from the human relations are important to the development and long-term sustainability of organizations. Human relations in the work environment and from a management point of view can be classified into two main points. The first is that human relations result from the meeting of management and workers. The second main point is this idea that the personal or human relationships that spring up, grow, and exist in any workplace environment. The improvement of relations between all levels has been accepted as a very important element in the development and improvement of any organization. And there are a few long-term successful managements which have not really exerted a great deal of effort in this direction. There is, however, the possibility that the policy of improved human relations may be pursued solely because of its effect on productivity, and not really from a more fundamental motive of producing a correct and balanced attitude to the personal and social needs of the worker. Merely to aim for higher output may potentially bring neither greater output nor satisfaction to the worker. However, if the aim is to bring more personal satisfaction to the worker in his or her work and their surroundings, then both higher output and job satisfaction may be achieved. Good human relations can only be established if the needs of an individual are satisfied and his or her will to work is stimulated. This presents the difficulty that management is dealing with a group of individuals, all of whom may respond differently in a given situation. However, it is also possible to generalize on the average response evoked in certain situations. In the context of human relations, it is possible to arrive at some general conclusions about the individual's attitude to work and the hopes, fears, and aspirations the individual has regarding it. The extent to which these hopes and desires are fulfilled in the work situation or working environment naturally governs the degree of job satisfaction derived by the worker. The extent to which the personal job satisfaction is achieved is the measure by which each worker will apply his or her abilities and will to work. To achieve this aim, it is necessary to provide motivation of the right type to all in the organization. So when we look at the working environment, it describes the following relationships and factors. It includes the human relationships such as management and trade unions with which the individual is concerned. It involves the working group in which an individual is a member of. It involves the motivational policies of the organization, as well as the productivity agreements of the individual's organization, It involves the physical conditions that affects the individual, as well as the psychological factors of the work situation. When we look at the Hawthorne studies led by Mayo, we find a few sort of key findings from their investigations and a few key sort of conclusions. Most notably is this idea that work is a group activity. Moreover, the social world of the adult is primarily patterned by work activities. They found that there's a need for recognition, security, and a sense of belonging is more important in determining workers' morale and productivity than the physical conditions under which the individual works. Supervisors need to listen to the personal context of employee complaints to understand the unique needs and satisfaction of each individual. In fact, a complaint is not necessarily an objective recital of facts. It is commonly a symptom manifesting disturbance in an individual's status position. Awareness of employee sentiments and employee participation can reduce resistance to change. We also see that the worker is an individual whose attitudes and effectiveness are conditioned by social demands from both inside and outside the organization. Individual work behavior is rarely purely a consequence of simple cause and effect relationships, but rather it's determined by a complex set of factors. We can also affirm this idea that there are informal groups within the organization which exercise strong social controls over the work habits and attitudes of the individual worker. The informal or primary work group develops its own set of norms, which mediates between the needs of the individual and the work setting. The social structure of these informal groups is maintained through job-related symbols of prestige and power. Finally, from the Hawthorne studies, we see that when there's a change from an established society in the home to an adaptive society in the organization, notably resulting from the use of new techniques, it has a tendency to disrupt the organization. Finally, from the Hawthorne studies, we see that group collaboration does not occur by accident. It must be planned and developed. If group collaboration is achieved, the human relations within an organization may reach a cohesion which resists the disrupting effects of adaptive society. The human relations approach, although basically one idea, has several levels of application. On the most superficial level, it means talking in a nice, human, considerate way to subordinates instead of using the more authoritative forms of speech. Seen in a more deeper fashion and in more psychological terms, it means being sensitive to others' psychological needs and expressions, understanding the other, and taking his or her feelings into account. It might mean being more democratic rather than an authoritarian way of leading individuals, minimum levels of coercion, a maximum levels of persuasion, two-way communication, direct or representative participation in decision-making, and a sharing of responsibility. It was long believed, and still many do, that supervision applying these standard techniques will achieve higher quality and quantity of production, as well as higher satisfaction of the workers. Participation is considered an important way for achieving both aims. There are, of course, many criticisms of the human relations school. Most human relations studies either avoid the fact of cultural differences by not discussing them, or by assuming that workers are a constant factor themselves from which standard and desirable reactions may be elicited by a standardized program. For instance, all workers are expected to prefer democratic supervision over authoritarian supervision and to welcome responsibility. There seems to be this implicit cultural associations behind these beliefs, namely that the worker has a democratic personality. It is overlooked that this may be a consequence of being raised in a democratic family, school, and society, of being used to democratic leadership and having internalized democratic values. What about the worker who has been raised in a different society and has a more authoritarian personality? There is some material which indicates that workers in such cultures, in so-called traditional societies will tend to be most effective and most satisfied under a paternalistic authoritarian supervision. For these workers, any other types of leadership, including democratic leadership, may be disruptive and disturbing. The basic assumption of the human relations philosophy is that human relations approach is better tuned to the basic psychological needs of the human being than any other approach. The alternative hypothesis suggests that even in the long run, after the workers have been thoroughly exposed to the human relations approach, they will not prefer it. In short, the human relations approach, like many other adaptive structures, while it solves some problems, it does create some new ones. This ends our lecture on the Human Relations School. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at the institutional school, and we'll be looking at how institutions and organizations interact with each other and their effect on society at large.